So, so just want to check. So that means I know that several of you, Tanya, Lo, Rachel, have been able to get to the Padlets. And Alex and Morgan, have you? Morgan too, right? I think you posted as well. Hi,
Yes.
Morgan. And Alex, have you been able to get onto the sign onto the Padlet?
I was, yeah.
Okay, good, great. All right. And I know, I don't know about Cameron. Yeah, okay. I think that means we're okay. We're on there. So I have a chance. Whoops. Let's go back here. So that's cool. Great. Just checking here. Great. So yeah, this will be a scratch pad, and we just keep you just keep using it from here on out. Especially as thoughts come to mind during the discussions, maybe we can type. People just freely can just type in some comments along the way, or maybe some keywords in the chat, just to capture thoughts that maybe we don't have time to pick up in discussion, and then we can always come back later in Padlet. Okay, how about that? There's lots of good references that come up in discussion. Okay, today I just want to dive right in. We have three articles, and I thought we just walk through them and use them kind of as a spine for our discussion. Um, and the beginning point for this section and the next section has to do with representations, with basically what strengths we have from representations and what are the limits of representations. So I thought I'd first check in with you all um, on what kinds of representations you're most comfortable with, or in your work. Okay, and then maybe take a tally right now, all kinds of representations people use. Hi, Cameron. So just to start off, kind of the survey, okay, of sorts. So why don't we just start? With what are some representations that you work with most closely? Kinds of representations.
I would say for me in working in like virtual reality projects, there's a lot of both visual and narrative like storytelling representation. So trying to represent things in the real world, in the virtual world.
Mhm. So, and what do they represent then? What kinds of things can you represent well with VR?
Um, Representing career paths, representing environments, representing data, um, and tools, use of tools, in the field that students wouldn't otherwise have access to, or representing them in the virtual world.
Just curious, how do you represent the career path?
Well, so for our project, it's like a three-act experience, and in each act, the student is in a different role.
Mhm.
So, the first act, they're in the role of a broadcast meteorologist trying to help warn people before a hurricane hits. In the second act, they're flying into a hurricane on a hurricane hunter plane, to collect data. And then in the last act, they're like part of an emergency rescue support team surveying the damage.
That's very rich and very multimodal. Okay, very interesting. Um, I'd like to dive in more for that later on, but let's keep going. Okay, so who's up? What else? What other example?
I work with lots and lots and lots of data. So community level census type data, collected data on, all kinds of things. I use remotely sensed data quite a lot. So satellite data that is collected and representing certain environmental phenomena. But lots of census data and health data from the CDC, just basically trying to recreate the experiences of people and what they're exposed to as they move through life, but it's generally large population level data.
So knowing what your background is, a little bit about your background. Um, what's interesting about that kind of large sets of data is that they're indexed on something, right? I mean, oftentimes they're indexed on what array, how, you know.
So, so if I understand your question correctly, you know, so we're looking at spatial arrangements of data, right? So geographies, right? So county, census tract, block group, spatial relationships. So I work a lot in GIS with spatial statistics and spatial clustering.
So that's index on space. Census data too, index on space, and also if it's population, I guess there's index on people.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right. So it's index.
Yeah. So slicing that up in numerous ways. You know, looking at age, gender, race, socio, demographic variables, income levels, those kinds of things. Yeah.
So if it's structured like that, we can actually change what's the independent parameter. So we can say it's indexed on where they live, indexed on who they are, indexed on any other parameter you care to index on, and then you can do other things. That's very powerful. So, but the most important thing is that there's a kind of geospatial aspect to some of that kind of data. Whereas with the VR, it's, if I'm understanding, VR would be like there's some sort of narrative structure. So it might be timeline based, it might be action based, but there's some independent, so-called independent parameter. There would be time. I hate this. Anyway, time. If anybody knows how to turn that off, I'll turn it. This is AI, right? Independent parameter could be time, narrative time, player time, or player action. Right. True. Doesn't have to be, but there is in this case some sort of notion of independent parameter. Okay, let's keep moving. So I'm typing these into notes, and yeah, thanks, Rachel. If you want to keep on going, copying to Padlet, that's really fantastic. Lo, how about you?
Well, it's a little new for me to think about the representation. So are we thinking of in terms of what I do, or? Can you hear me?
Yes, I can. Go ahead.
I'm sorry, I probably should move to upstairs.
You're fine. We can see and hear you. So I was just asking, what kind of representations? Oh, you're gonna move? Then we should move on while you shift location. What about Alex or Morgan?
Yeah. First of all, apologies. I'm having transportation issues right now, so my camera's gonna be off just for a little bit. But the kind of the representation that I use a lot in my work is all kind of precedent based, and it has a deeply abstract and philosophical argumentative approach. So it's data in a way, but it's more qualitative.
Precedent, like in legal cases. Does you mean like legal precedent?
Yeah, and legal writing.
So then I just know, so I'm looking at these libraries, such huge volumes of shelves of cases, and they're really mind-numbingly detailed, right? So each one is a succinct summary of case and a ruling, right? So what would you say what's being represented then in these law books, these law databases?
Oh gosh, what isn't being represented? Accounts, experiences, opinions, recommendations for the future, etc.
But there's a syntax to that, right? I mean, classically, there's a syntax, right? There's some sort of, I'm sure this is what people learn. I mean, there's some syntax in terms of like who are the parties to, I mean, I'm just saying amateurishly, right? There's some sort of adversarial relationship. Like, let's say there's a claimant, there's a plaintiff, etc. And then there's a contention by one side, that's a complaint. And then then there are some sort of sets of evidences that are being drawn together, which are described. There might be appeals to use it precedent, so it appeals to precedents, which are other cases. So this case refers to other cases, all right? And they're rulings. So that's what's important. They're rulings that are set up as elements of an argument, right? That could be used as elements in an argument, right? So
Right. Yeah.
there's a syntax to that. There's a syntax to that, right?
A lot.
It's pretty formal in that case, right? It's interesting. This is a very interesting example because it's a really different kind of representation than the other examples. So it's a whole other
Right.
category. Yeah. Okay, good. So we have that on the table. What about Alex or Cameron? I'm going by role now. So what about Alex? And if you can say something verbally, that's good. We don't.
Sorry about that.
If you can hear us,
I can hear you guys. I can hear you guys.
yeah, yeah.
So, can someone else go? I'm a little dim. I need to figure out actually what to say here.
Lo, what about you? We're back since you relocated.
Sorry, where was it?
I was giving Lo the baton now because Lo seems to have settled into a different.
Okay. All right.
So,
Sorry about that.
what kind of representations could you put up as an example?
So, for same as Tanya, I've done some data visualization. So it's a representation for the data and how I want to display the relationship and how to guide the audience through them. So it's also a representation of how of myself, because on the data are not alive. It's how I bring the connection together. So that's also kind of the same with design. It's all about the relationship between each element. So I would say it's a representation of not only the information I trying to deliver, but also the the guide of where I want the people to focus on. And last semester, I worked a lot out with the interaction on in the 3D spatial space or 2D space. So for the interaction, I would say it's a representation of for the interaction, you need two part. You need the audience and the part that is interact with. So the representation, I think, is go two ways. It's representing the information I'm showing it to the audience, but also how the audience react. That's part of the interaction. I think that goes both ways, the representation.
Introducing an interesting vocabulary for us, and I think since I work in some of those related areas, I think I know what you're saying. Can you give us an example of that work, either 2D or 3D?
For example, last semester we trying to create this interacting space that, let's say it represent the time. We want the audience to. We live in a world that times is always exists. It flows in a space. It could fast forward. Sometimes we look into the past. It's all the time being. So how do we make the audience to feel the existence of time? So when they are just sitting there for a long period of time, what if we can give them some feedback?
Mm-hmm.
It might be visually, or it might be some feeling audio. If they are move their body in the space, does it representing flow of the time, and with those sense that the audience feel in a particular space, they might have the illusion of, actually seeing the time flows in front of their eyes.
Okay. And what kinds of times are we talking about? The different kinds of time. So,
So just for the project matter, I think the easiest way to representing time is to either stretch the time out. So we are focusing on just a slice of time and to slow it down. And the other way is to fast forward, is to compress the whole timeline into small pieces so that to either slow the time down or make the time fast, just to show the trace or to show the um I'm not sure if this is the right word, but just to demonstrate the impact of certain things in on order to demonstrate the time, I would say.
Very nice. I mean, there's a video artist named Bill Viola. I typed the name into chat, Bill Viola. Is that ringing any bells for anyone? Great, great video artist. Okay, you can look him up and Google for him. But the way to see his work is really at scale because he did these really large installation projects. One of them I think was called Birthday Party, and I remember seeing it, in the gallery, so at the right scale. I remember walking into the room. The room wasn't that big. It was about like the size of a bedroom, just carpet on the floor. 3 walls were just bare, gallery walls. And the fourth wall, which was about, 12, 15 feet high, pretty high, was just one giant, large image. It's like looking through a grainy window into a birthday party, a very domestic scene, a kid, maybe 10, 12, whatever, with a bunch of friends. And it was a birthday party, what she had shot. I don't know, maybe it was an hour long, maybe even less, maybe 30 minutes. But he slowed it so much that it would take a whole day, 24 hours to 12 or 24 hours to screen. So they were incredibly slow motion. And he did these beautiful works like that, where he would take videos, but he would shoot them in film. So at high res with film, and then put them back in high res video. And he'll slow them down like 100 times or more. So because it's such high res, it looked like portraits. It was his videos were so high definition, they looked like portraits, but they were moving. Because if you just waited long enough, you'll notice they started changing, their stance with respect to each other. So that's an extreme case.
It wasn't fast enough that you could notice immediately that there was
no motion blur. There was no motion blur because they're a high res, high quality film, shot in film. So there was no motion blur. So it was amazing. It looked like still images, but if you waited long enough, you'll notice, wait a minute, they're actually moving. They're beautiful works, actually. So that was one series like that. So there are things you can do. Oh, but okay, so there's narrative time, the time of the action is happening in the scene, whatever that is. But then there's also the spectator time, right? And there's also different kinds of time. Like if you talk about interaction, there's also the time of the logic. So we'll begin to separate that. Okay. Now, Alex. Well, or Cameron, if you want to go.
I just wanted to, that reminds me of like the experience of times with, say, like when we look at a mountain, we're not perceiving the growth of the mountain. It seems still to us, right? Whereas if we look at like bacterial growth is like many orders of magnitude faster, at least scale proportional wise than a mountain is. And so there's this like interesting relation of like stillness and change that is highly dependent on time and our perception of time.
Nice example of that, because I always think about this about mountains and geological time. I really think that, don't you think that maybe if you look at processes that have such a long time scale, that they turn into conditions, rather than action. they condition things like, forests grow and people build cities along the mountains, things like that. So maybe really it's just a different scale of time that we're thinking about. If we take a thoroughly processualist view of things, maybe what we think of as conditions or uh, you know constants really are just slow processes, very slow processes. But Cameron, why don't you give us some examples of representations that you
Sure. I focused mostly in complex adaptive systems, and that's a highly representational, highly abstract field. I mean, one of the primary like structure of representation is like a network, which is a highly you've translated a series of rich interactions into like points and lines, more or less. And the uh, the insight that one can gather within that is high. There's a concept called coarse graining, which is sort of like it's almost like the reverse of what's this Bill Viola was doing with the birthday party, is if you were to speed up the birthday party, you would notice things that you wouldn't be able to notice if it were super slowed down. I mean, a perfect example of coarse graining is if you like the what is it called, pointillism paintings, or if you go super close, right, you only see a bunch of different colored dots. But if you zoom out, the picture will emerge. So if you blur the painting, actually, it will be more clear. And so that's one insight or one kind of approach that complex systems uses in regards to networks.
Yeah.
And like networks come to represent anything from like gene relationships to people moving around in a city to like synapses in the brain, etc., to cats interacting with their humans.
Yeah. The graph representation. It's pretty basic, actually. We'll come back to that. In fact, speaking of cats, is that a cat, Rachel?
Yeah, sorry.
No, I'm a cat person. There are two cats in this house, and they may come up at some point. They like being on keyboards. So
If I lock her out, she just scratches at the door. So I just work around her till she
no,
sits
I
down.
love cats. I think cats are an example of a pan-dimensional creature that actually intersects our space in just 3 dimensions out of the 20. So
But the camera doesn't think so. The camera views it as background.
Camera things, and
Not
also,
as being.
no,
Yeah.
really, I really do think that they live in a much higher dimensional space than humans. So, okay, now, Alex, have we given you enough time to think a little bit more? Just some examples of representations that I like to put on the table. It doesn't have to be visual.
So with the stuff we're talking about, it reminds me of like some of the work I'm actually doing right now. I'm doing a lot of military analyzing of conflicts of all over the world. So some parts in the Middle East and actually in like with Ukraine, and how switching things how things are changing every day. So things are how information and data, everything is of the war is changing every day. And there's actually a great visualizer if you don't mind if I actually can share with you guys.
Of course.
Just bring up the map here. There we go. Sorry, it's a process here. Screen. Yeah, this is some of the work I'm actually. This is some of the resources I'm actually using. Some like a visualizer of information. So yeah, just it's not super advanced, but like it's like visualizing data of like stuff I'm actually interested in. So
But can we drill down into some of these
yep.
points? and see
Sorry.
what,
These events here.
yeah, they can drill down into any of these points and see what information they give us. If you click on any of these
Oh
circles,
yeah. Oh yeah. So yeah, if you click on like, for example, here,
Mhm.
let me just,
Okay,
yeah, we can,
goes to
yeah, yeah. And this is like some of the visual stuff I'm working with right now, with like data. There's like other sources I'm working with, but I can't really say who they are just because you know, military operations are kind of kept secrets, fortunately. But yeah, that's some of the stuff I'm actually working with.
Mhm.
Yeah, it's like visual. It's like what we're talking with, like visual, like visualizing data. So
Mhm. What do you think is, or anybody, because this actually relates obviously to the kind of geolocated information that geospatial information that Tanya was talking about. I mean, what do you think are the different kinds of information that are afforded by those two big kinds of representations? One's map, and the other is sequence of posts, text posts. What kinds of information can we get from one that we can't get from the other?
sorry, was it?
I'm asking you. I'm asking you.
You broke up a little bit
I'm
there.
sorry. I'm just asking. You have these two different kinds of representations. One is a bunch of posts, right? Text, basically, and the other is a map. So I'm asking, what kind of information can you get from
Yeah,
one, you know, versus the other?
yeah. Um, for stuff like this, from what I'm seeing, it's really hard to actually use graphics to visualize stuff. It just with when it comes to like military information data and all that stuff. I'm sure there's someone creative who can make like some visuals, some like really nice visual stuff, but like important data when it comes to like military stuff, it's it's yeah, this is the best way from what I've seen.
Can we share? Sorry, would you
If that makes sense.
Alex, would you mind sharing again that image just so we can point to it again?
Oh, the map? Oh, sure.
Yes, please.
Sure. Yeah. There
I
we
mean,
go.
the combination
Yeah.
of the textual aspect of that
Yeah.
it lent, so the map is, I think, often dehumanizing, right? Like you
Yeah.
forget like that it's very abstract, but then you have these words that clearly come from a person, an individual having typed out those words. And there's a sequential nature to them that you could see on the map, but we don't right here.
Here, there are a
Yeah.
bunch of names. Can we scroll down some more of the
Oh, sure. Oh, the data or just like
on the
this?
text? Yeah, I'm just looking for something in addition to the proper names. Okay, conducted airstrike. There's an event. Russian aviation conducted airstrike at blah blah blah. So that's an event, right? And there's
Yeah.
reported in the evening report, blah blah blah. And like Tanya's saying, there's some. If you're from the area, of course, these names mean a lot. They'll be redolent with meaning for you, for the person. And then there are events. Can we scroll some more to see if there are other kinds of
Sure.
information in the text?
Sure. Just don't want to stop.
Yeah. Okay. All right. All right. All right.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
Yeah. Sorry.
That's good. Okay.
I just had a thought, and it's kind of about what Cameron and Lou were just talking about, and Bill Viola, but we were discussing how, you can't always see things that are moving or progressing through time. I was in class yesterday and we were talking a little bit about, kind of the life experience that humans have and whatnot. And we started talking about like the contents of the actual Earth itself and earthquakes. And I thought that was, kind of a cool concept that ties into this because that's, over time, the core of the Earth is moving and then everything inside the Earth is moving and then there's tectonic plates and then
Uh-oh. Morgan? Morgan's frozen just at the climax. Oh no. Can somebody fill in for what Morgan was going to say?
It's a representation of time.
Yeah. It's very frustrating. So I'm guessing that Morgan's going to be talking about, yeah, the dynamics of the Earth. Oh, are you back? Okay, we'll give Morgan a chance. Hi, welcome back.
Zoom
Just
just
to
told
the
me.
climax, just to the best part of your comment. Okay,
I know. That
tell
was
us- okay, so what we're
well,
gonna say.
gonna say is it's like earthquakes and feeling the earth move and stuff like that. It's feeling time in comparison to kind of seeing time, as Bill Viola's work shows us and stuff. So anyways, that was my thought. Sorry it took so long to say.
I'm writing this note just to capture it. Okay. By the way, you guys, these are just keywords I'm typing in the chat and we're not quick enough. So later on, when Rachel, whoever puts them back into Padlet, maybe you can flesh it out yourselves, if you can. Yeah, feeling time, this goes back to the geological time issue. Something about earthquakes also was making me think about complex systems, because people can model natural processes using graphs. Here with earthquakes in the earth, you know, I wish I could switch back and forth. I should, next time, I'd have two cameras running. That's what I'll do. Okay, so here's the Earth, and then mantle, mesosphere, whatever, in the core. Okay, so there's the Earth. So when there's an earthquake, the shock goes through the planet, and then they refract. It refracts. It's like sound going through water or something like that. But then it refracts so that these waves of pressure don't travel the same way as if they were going through a uniform medium. So if you put up listening posts in other parts of the planet, and they get these arrival times of the shocks at these different listening posts. What is going on here? Huh. Okay. All we know is what we can pick up at the surface of the planet, different arrival times of the shock coming from over here. So we can't actually see inside this planet. It's actually opaque to us, okay? We just have some hypotheses that the planet is like an onion and there's different layers inside. So it's been a major problem to infer what the interior structure of the planet is only based on the arrival times of various bangs from specific earthquakes. Okay, most of them that we can detect are in the very thin layer near the surface. So basically, it's a shock on the edge on the surface. We get echoes on the surface, and we have to infer from those arrival times what's the inside like. It's a really big problem. It's not done so much by graphs in this case. It's done by modeling solids like an onion. Okay, so in this case, the representation, the intermediate representation, is a solid body with rings, well, spheres, okay, shells, and then we think with that representation about what its dynamics might be if you bang it, like a bell. So there's something else here too. Okay, so there's all sorts of representations. Yeah, geoacoustics. Okay, it's an acoustics of the Earth. It's very beautiful. This problem was recently solved not too long ago. It's a big problem. Okay, now with representations, we can think about who's making representation of what and for what purpose. We have a big survey right now, and we obviously just been scratching the surface with various large categories. I'd like to go to the illusion of control paper by Gary Dirks and Sander van der Loo. So let me go to share screen and look at it with you. See if I can get it. Yeah, I have it here. Okay, I wonder if I can do it. Oh, that's one way to do it. Here it is. It's quicker. Okay. So, and after this, we'll take a break, okay, before I go to the other one. But I thought maybe we could just use this, like I said, as a bunch of talking points to go through, but some background, all right? So Gary Dirks, the first author here, the second author here, Gary Dirks, can't see that, can you? There we go, okay. I think I may have mentioned they're both at ASU. Gary Dirks was president of British Petroleum China for about 30 years, and he built that part of British Petroleum from basically nothing over all that time into a multi-billion-dollar subsidiary of British Petroleum, or a multi-billion-dollar division of British Petroleum China. It's a big deal, okay? And he saw at that time, he got to know basically the leadership of China. He knows, the people who are currently in charge, like Xi Jinping. And he also got a kind of a bird's eye view of a lot of the international geopolitics during that period of time. And President Crow recruited him to basically kind of having an insider's view, basically to look at just and forms of energy transition, basically to kind of, and he's been a very important part of the Global Futures Lab, and he's been really applying his in-depth knowledge to thinking through, how to, undo basically a lot of the damage that's been done from the kind of work of his own original industry, right? So, and this comes up also in this paper too. It's informed by a lot of knowledge about how large corporations work at this level of geopolitics. Sander has a very different background. Sander is by training an archaeologist from Belgium, and he then went to France. He was there. He was in charge of the Central Scientific Research Agency of France. He didn't like the bureaucracy. Went to Cambridge, and then President Crow invited him over to start up the School of Sustainability. He was the first dean of sustainability at ASU years ago. And Sanders, one of the original faculty in complex adaptive systems, along with Manfred. I think, Cameron, you're working with Manfred, right? Manfred Laubicher. So I learned a lot from these two people about, how, complex systems work in life, meaning in, let's say, in economies and in societies. Sanders' big study was with the European Union. He did a study with about 300 scientists and historians and archaeologists about how European societies co-evolved over several thousand years with nature. In other words, how societies and their environments co-articulated one another over centuries. So he has an interesting point of view about like large-scale changes, things like that. Okay, so that's background for the authors, right? So what I'd like to do is see if some of you like to draw attention to some passages in this text. You see, I've already marked my own, but maybe we can walk through some of it and see. So why don't I turn off the share screen since you have your own copies in front of you. We don't need that. Here.
There's one thing that really stuck with me from this article, and it's on a much more personal note than maybe like an academic note. But it's also related to another class I'm taking. But I didn't know what page it was on. But it basically explained, using the god Janus as a reference, that there's anxiety in looking at the past and there's anxiety in looking at the future, but there's very rarely anxiety when you're looking at the present. And I know like presence and mindfulness have always gone together, but that just like made years worth of hearing these phrases talked about make sense and click to me. So I really appreciated that perspective personally.
Let's go into this Janus part. It's interesting. Facto.
I think it's the section 3.
Yeah.
That's page 5 on mine. I was also taken by, I thought this concept, even the title and how they discussed this as the present being constructed by an interaction between the past and the future. I'd like to think about that a little more, but I find that a pretty compelling idea.
This thing about, yeah, me too. I thought that section had an interesting title. I was wondering that's in fact one thing I wanted to discuss, to say, what do they mean by that, So they talk about in the middle of that section, right after the Janus picture, about ex post perception and ex ante perception. So I was wondering if anybody can help us make sense of that, the post facto way of thinking about things versus what's the other one, ex ante ways of thinking about things. So post facto, I think we can guess from everyday language, from language. But what do you think they mean by that? Ex post or post facto perception versus the other kind.
So I think he was saying here, I looked at it and I interpreted this as saying, there's what we know, what already exists, and what we've already decided about what exists, and then the parts that we haven't decided about, in terms of what exists.
They say here, exploitation of things known from the past. That's the ex post way of thinking about things. Like we've experienced something either individually or collectively, and we quote learn from the past. So based on I've been stung by bees and I had this bad reaction, But the other kind is exploration of novel phenomena. I'm just reading here. Exploration of novel phenomena that creates new knowledge. That would be the other attitude. All right.
This is not really a point of clarity, but this kind of reminds me of Kuhn's approach to science in like paradigm 1, and then crisis, rediscovery, paradigm 2. So it's like, you spend if you're a scientist, you spend all your time trying to disprove theories to come up with a new thing. So it's kind of the same thing as Tanya was just saying about, rediscovery based on what we don't know.
So in fact, that's a good reference because they mentioned Kuhn too, right? In this article, they talk about Thomas Kuhn, and people know about this phrase paradigm shift, right? So that comes from that famous book that Kuhn wrote on how paradigms work in sciences. And what was the example, if you looked at that, what kinds of scientific revolutions did Kuhn look at for those paradigm shifts? Anybody remember? Or any kind of scientific revolution, that's what he was talking about in that book, the structure of scientific revolutions, and looking at how one kind of paradigm in science or narrative for how to make an account of the world is challenged by something else, and then something else has to get constructed. Anybody? Well, even without reading the book, can you come up with some example from history of science of some big shifts in paradigm?
I mean,
sorry.
No, please, Morgan, go ahead.
I was gonna say people thought the earth was flat, and then we discovered that it wasn't flat.
Oh, you missed out a flat? Wait a minute. Whoa. Nobody told me that. Flat Earth Society.
I don't know, your drawing was pretty flat. So
yeah, very 2D.
2D, I know. We need the and also speaking of Earth, the heliocentric versus geocentric, right? The Earth at the center of the universe and shifting to sun being centered. Well, not of the universe, but of the solar system. Big shift, and that was a big Copernican shift that Thomas Kuhn was looking at. In fact, that's one of the big examples. However, those two paradigms, heliocentric and geocentric paradigms for the solar system, they coexisted. I mean, the Arabs had pictures in their manuscripts from centuries before Galileo, where they put the sun in the middle. And I guess even classical times. So they were competing models. Now that's a bit different than maybe ex ante perception, which is exploration of novel phenomena, creating new knowledge. So there's something subtle going on, right? I mean, this is now we get into the heart of the paper here. So if we just work under one paradigm, let's say scientific paradigm, like Earth is in the middle, then we have these observations, like you look up in the sky through the telescope and you see things moving. And if under the classical paradigm, there are several things going on. One is under the classical Christian paradigm in the Middle Ages, the Earth is in the middle, in the center, and the heavens being perfect, nothing changes. I mean, you don't have new things appearing out of nothing or disappearing, because that would mean that the eternal sphere is not eternal. That's God's domain. See, and that was kind of observation which would be impossible actually to accommodate inside the classical Christian medieval cosmology. That people get burned at the stake for that. Right?
I really liked the beginning of section 7, like the digging a hole metaphor. I thought that was clever and very realistic.
What was the digging a hole example?
Large components of our societies are deeply involved in digging a hole for themselves by hanging on to their illusion of control and ignoring many of the changes in their environment.
And then at some point later on, he says, we could just stop digging. He says that,
Yes,
right?
yeah.
He does say that. I think, thinking about what you were just saying in this kind of idea of novel exploration of something novel, and there's an implication in what you're talking about that something doesn't match the belief system and the knowledge. There's new knowledge, something new comes in that challenges that. But that's where we start to look for these new explanations. But a lot of this was, I don't know, it was a little bit difficult because it kind of implied that you can't use that kind of evidence to shift what people know, which was a little disheartening to read about.
And that's very disheartening. If we go back to the beginning of the paper, I'm just searching for the word noise, and it comes up in section 2. That's, I think, speaking to what Tanya's pointing to here. If you look at the section 2, so let's say there's a given paradigm. Well, I'm using paradigm loosely, but just say it's a bunch of categories that they talk about here in the paper, categories by which you can sort of categorize experience. And then, but according to the categories that are well-defined, sharply defined, there's going to be phenomena that don't fit inside those categories. And those are called noise. They're not recognized. They're not classified. So you can't actually explain them or label them, right? So another word for that, which is not interpretable or labelable, is noise. So we'll just hang on to that. Okay. Now we're jumping to the middle of this paper. We should work backwards from that category. So how do categories explain to these people? How do they play a role in knowledge? We can go back maybe to just around that part here in section 2, a model of knowledge acquisition.
So my understanding was kind of that you need a balance. Categorization isn't inherently a bad thing, because if you have closed categories, it helps to give direction and focus to a society, but that you need open categories to take in the new information and learn new things and grow and change.
Yeah, I'm looking through section 2 for this. Here, section 4 is categories. Okay, section 4 is categories. So let's take a look here. Just give us a minute. Yeah, go ahead.
One of the things, I mean, right at the beginning, he's talking about this, coherence between what we already know and new information, novel observations. And that reminds me of, it's like if you have something that's too new that is outside and can't connect or link or be adjacent to what we already know, then you can't see it.
Mm-hmm.
Is like it doesn't compute, right?
If it's too close, you're saying if it's too close.
If it's too far away, if it's
away.
not close enough, then you just don't see it. It doesn't make sense. It's just static. It's just noise. And maybe I'm misinterpreting that too. So
I'm wondering if I can, let me just share what I'm looking at right now. Yes, Christian. Yes, I think that makes sense. I'm going to share screen to just the passage I'm looking at. Yes, okay. Okay, do y'all see category, it's section on categorization? The diagram doesn't matter so much. It's the paragraph above it.
yes.
Okay, all right. So we'll come back to the beginning, all right, because that's kind of motivating all this, but we're deep into the how it's working, you know. So basically here, right here, they're saying this, remember we're talking about exploitation of the past, things we learned from the past, and looking forward, exploration of novelty, you know, in things in novel situations. And here they're saying that these are based in categories. This is part of their argument that we structure, we group things together in certain ways, okay, and we organize our experiences through these categories. And that's okay, you know, that's what I'm saying, you know, it gives us leverage, right? The categories can be categories of animals, could be even grammar, right? Different kinds of parts of speech, these are categories. So all sorts of categories happening, social categories, etc. Now the issue for these people comes up with the sharpness of these categories. That's what they talk about, closing categories. Categories become more and more closed. So let me just stop share here, right? And I know some of you have been in seminar before where we talk about this, is if you make a distinction in the world saying, like, you know, citizen, non-citizen, human, not human, okay, live, dead, etc. These are very useful, obviously, right? The question is how sharply do we maintain those distinctions, right? So it's very tempting, isn't it, to make a sharp distinction, because then we can sort of quote rely upon it. You know, the same thing like end of life issues, right? Is this patient alive or dead, right? Can we harvest the organs? You know, should we keep on prolonging life? What should we do, right? It becomes a very tough. Any of us who've lived through having a family member to decide for, this is one of the hardest decisions you will ever have to make, you know. So and even if you discuss it ahead of time with your mom or dad, you know, it's a really or a close relative, it's a really hard decision when the time comes, okay? Because in a sense, at that point, I know from having lived through it, there's no category for this. There's absolutely no way. There's no line. There's no line. Absolutely not. So yet when we try to think, quote, abstractly, we try to make a category and maybe make a written description of it, or a mathematical description, or even a graphical one, you know, like those lines of the Ukraine map of Ukraine, Crimea, where is this, right? It can be epistemically comforting to have a sharp category, sharply defined category, or membership in a category can be defined by some procedure, and that procedure is quote to objective, which means anybody can apply the procedure and arrive at the same result, etc., etc. This paper here, what's one of the most fundamental arguments is that this is natural. This happens in our societies. But if it goes too far, then what we get would be these, we don't actually capture more and more of the world. We actually exclude more and more phenomena. They're relegated to noise. Okay. So
it's interesting to look at the sharpness of categories as a tool of facilitating like social or like group consensus, or like common understanding. I mean, for sure in the legal domain, you have to create some type of like line of like, what is this, what is not this, and then you have to generalize that across all cases, so that there isn't what's the word, like disparity or like unfairness is seen. Or then like in uh other types of, let's say, like I don't know, I'm blanking on other examples right now, but I think the legal context is a very salient example of the sociality of that's necessary as a like communications tool. And then ambiguity and blurring of categories then makes it more difficult, perhaps ultimately better, but more difficult, as in more time needs to be spent on it, of like what is something and what is not. So I think there's a trade-off of like ease of communication and like consensus in a group, and then like the blurriness of and sharpness of categories.
It's a very important point, very important point. And I'm going to go back to this paragraph here where just below the diagram, the figure here. And so one is just blurriness and the social dependency, social contingency of categories. Another, I've been reading this several times, and now this time I picked up something more from this paper. It's another kind of process that's going on with the closure of categories. Is right here, I highlighted it, which is at some point these categories defined by maybe what's called extrinsic, but maybe it's better to say contingent factors. Like in this case, they talk about a chair, and what are chairs? Well, I mean, we could go around the table, around and around, and say, what's a chair? What's a chair, right? Does it have to have four legs? Well, what if it only has one big fat leg? Is that still a chair? What if it's a beanbag? Is it a chair? You get into this kind of slippery slope type things, right? But then you say, well, what if you took a big bag of beans? Sorry, a big bag of, okay, I won't go there right now. But these categories are still, those kinds of definitions are defined based on extrinsic, or I should say contingent factors, right? Is it being used to sit on, right? And then you can, in what culture, and maybe what's considered chair in one culture is considered a box in a different situation. But then look at what they say. In the second phase, these categories get replaced. They replace the space-time constraints, which I don't think space-time is a good word for it, but anyway, space-time constraints by definitions based on intrinsic characteristics, meaning just characteristics were defined more abstractly within the logical structure of categories themselves. This becomes an abstract. Categories used to be defined by contingent factors, like how is it being used? Is it used as a chair, in a chairish way? Become abstracted into, well, it should have four legs, let's say, and a horizontal surface, right? So this kind of abstraction can go on in general with all sorts of categories. And it's related to what Cameron's saying. Okay.
So is that like, it's like the functionality versus then just something about that object itself? Is that what you're saying?
And then when we say the object itself, I don't want to be careful because object itself is already kind of abstraction. In fact, the next paper we'll talk about in the weird paper, the weirdest people in the world paper, they talk about this kind of Western cultural habit of defining an entity in itself rather than in relation to. So this is interesting. That's already an example of an abstracting way of thinking, right? So going back to the chair example is quite helpful. It's kind of helpful. I think we'll take a break soon anyway, micro break. But the chair example is really nice because I'll tell you the story. So it's just a side story. In Florence back in, I don't know, remember what century. Have you ever been to the city Florence, Firenze in Italy? Okay, have to go. Okay, once. It's an amazing city. It's kind of the city of cities, right? And there's this big giant palace called the Palazzo Pitti, and it's really, to me, it's really brutal. It's brutal. It's because its stones are as big as cars. It's really massive and everything, just shows power. Apparently, the family, Pitti, they were in competition with another family in Italy. And these were very competitive cities, right? That's where we get Romeo and Juliet from, this kind of competitiveness of clans. Anyway, the story goes that these two families were competing with each other in the city. And one family built its castle or its palace, very grandly, spent huge amounts of money on it. And according to the story, the other family, I think it was the Pitti family, said, well, we'll do the one better. So they ordered their architects to build a palace for them, family home, that was so large that its inner courtyard was equal to the dimensions of the entire palace of the other family. So it was that much bigger. And everybody, was saying, wow, oh my God, they were very impressed. But and then they invited the whole city to come for a banquet, and including their competitor family. So, but the competitor family was pretty snarky, and they said, well, these people probably spent all their last coin on this, building this monstrosity, and we'll come and laugh at them because they probably, won't even have money left over for their furniture. And indeed, when they came to the banquet, there was a table laden with food, but no chairs. Instead of chairs, they only had burlap bags for them to sit on. So they were being very snarky. Ha, 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 look at these people. They spin themselves into pauperhood. They sat on the bags, and at a sign from the lord of the family, the host family, they had the men-at-arms come over with swords and sliced open each bag and outpoured torrents of gold. So that's a chair. Okay. Why don't we take a little break before we go on with this paper? There's a lot more to think about with this paper. It's about past, because we also want to take a look into the other paper too. Let's take 6 minutes. Okay, and come back at 40 past the hour. All right. Get some refreshment. I'll see you. I'll keep my video going though. Back to the illusion of control paper. There are a couple other places. I mean, there are many places here to stop and discuss things. So I wanted to just go to some of them and bring them into attention. Anyone else have some particular choice spots they'd like to draw attention to before we do this? You can raise your hand. Okay. I just, while I'm looking.
On page 11, I mean, I think this may be along the same lines of what we're talking about. There's this talk about Beckert and just the second paragraph, the last sentence. Becker's perspective thus opens the door to implicating the future and shaping the present rather than the reverse. And I just was very interested in that.
Yeah. Is that a section where talking about societies that are deeply involved in digging a hole by hanging on to the illusion of control? Yeah. Yeah, okay. I think at the very beginning of the paper too, they refer to this psychologist, I think, Kahneman, Kahneman, and I think they quoted him several times, at least twice, where they say people believe in what is it? How do they put it? Oh yeah, people believe in reasons if they like the conclusion.
Yeah, he says people believe the reasons because they believe in the conclusions.
Yeah, people believe in the reasons because they believe in the conclusions.
Yeah, the power of reason is an illusion. The belief will not change when the reasons are defeated.
We see that happening a lot, right?
Yeah, it explains a lot of the cognitive dissonance that I've been experiencing, like on the ground in real time, doing some community engagement work. We are seeing people say things like, yes, we want to prioritize increased transit use. No, do not prioritize reducing personal car trips. That
Right. At the same time, at the same time. Absolutely.
They want other people to take the bus.
So, and this has come up in like discussions about energy transactions too. We have all the science on board, but it doesn't matter because I still want to be able to live with the way I do. So the heart of the paper, that's on just before section 6. I'm looking here. It says a fundamental question for our times. Oh, sorry, back up. This brings into view the second part of their paper, which is about narratives. So they talk about categories and reasoning. So it's kind of an epistemic issue, right? But then they go on and say, look, it's not just this. There's a reason for people hanging on to their allegiance to certain kinds of conclusions. Let's put it this way. And then they place this in the form in the context of narratives, what they call narratives. And they say right away, I mean, or at least Sandra said to me, that these are not narratologists. Okay, that's not their domain, but they have respect for this, the power of narratives. And on what page is this? Page 8, or just before section 6, the last paragraph, section 5, they say the fundamental question for our times is, can we open up the narratives that underpin our worldviews? And if so, how? How can we do so? Okay, how can we break ourselves out of these strongly held categories that allow for a reduced view of what's going on? Okay, that's part of the effect of adhering to closed categories. They argue in this paper that it allows us to reduce the dimensionality of what needs to be accounted for. Okay, of course, this is not a mathematical paper, so these are not like strict mathematical definitions of dimension, but still, I think it makes sense. This idea, if you can just replace the messiness of dealing with experience palpably by some neatly defined categories, it just gives you a few smaller number of parameters to pay attention to, right? So it's understandable, right, that we would want that. But in order to change means, here they talk about narratives. What is it here? What did we talk about narratives? Let me go search. Yeah. Section 5. Yeah. Right. Section 5. So what are the examples? They look at myths and gods, the Greek myths, for example. Oh, here, they say that at the bottom, that the narratives, they say, they summarize the events in these highly multidimensional worlds that they call gestalts. Okay. So first of all, I don't think they ever define narrative. So what do you think could be a different way to understand what we mean by narrative here? It's not just the story. Okay, but can we have a working notion of it just for purposes of discussion? What do you guys say?
They use it in a way of sort of, it's almost like the framing through which we come to understand the world around us. It's like the story-based context in which we place ourselves and our knowledge and perception within.
And can we say somehow, can we think of narratives somehow more than stories? Because stories, okay, for me, it has a beginning, middle, end. It moves in kind of an arc. Let's say it's a unidimensional structure, like narrative time. But what about narrative? I like to think of narratives a bit more generously than that. So can we come up with something? Otherwise, it just collapses to stories.
I think it kind of comes. Oh, sorry.
No, please, please.
I think it kind of comes back to our starting discussion on representation, that the narrative is a representation and like Cameron was saying, like a framework to view things, but representing the way that we look at the world.
And also our like what we identify as valuable and our place in it.
Well, yeah. And then those maps that we saw from Alex of Ukraine, right? So you can have these kind of maps of the ongoing war in Ukraine. And we can say, well, is it just a data viz or is there a narrative here, right? Of course, if it helps to have a sequence in time. So then, yeah, okay, there's a historical narrative. But even without that, can we say sometimes that a visual graphic has a narrative and other times it's not? In other words, it's useful to be able to say some things are narrative, some representations have a narrative to it, and some representations don't. Otherwise, everything's a narrative. So can we say, for at least for the case of two-dimensional data viz, which of these are much more narrative than others? How? Hard question, actually. It's not an easy question. Here, I'll just say it and somebody else can find it later. Anybody heard of these books, seen these books? They're beautiful books by, I think it's Edwin Tufte, Tufte. Tufte. And he wrote these classic books on graphic layout design, on envisioning information. And they're kind of the Bibles of graphic design, graphic information design. Anybody who's interested in this can go look at it. I think, Tanya, you nod your head. So they're amazing books. They're beautiful books. Okay.
Yeah.
And there's
I have
one
copies of
and you have to see them, just exquisitely done. There's one I'll never forget. It's a map of Napoleon's march into Russia. And it shows this big fat arrow from France into Russia of the armies of Napoleon, and the width of the band is basically proportional to the number of soldiers in his army. And then it shows also where the different armies split off into other groups, moving to different parts of Russia along the way. So it shows also where they were dispatched. And then the arrows get thinner and thinner, because it also shows over time, I guess in the course of a year or so. So the beginning is big fat. It's heartbreaking to see. It gets thinner and thinner and thinner and thinner, and the winter really gets thin. And then you see this thin little line coming back to France at the end. So, but it's an amazing map because it shows dozens of parameters in this one image. It's an amazing, and it's a narrative for me. It's a narrative. It shows you many things. It shows you how Napoleon was defeated not only by the Russian generals, but by Russian winter, for example, and disease, etc. Supply lines, and many things. So many things are being bound up together. But those are explicit. Those are explicit representations for sure. Okay, but it is also a narrative, I think. It gives you a narrative structure. But it's not words per se. Not words, and no linear chain of words to give you a story. There are stories, plural, in them. So that gives me a suggestion for you, which is for us. I remember reading once a really nice description of a narrative, what the narrative is. It's at least in stories, at least in novels, but I think we can generalize it. It's a bunch of textual, Textual, textual structures, could be names or could be patterns of words that the author puts in place that conditions the subsequent experience by a reader of this world that the author has built up. So the key thing is that they're the specific patterns of words. Okay, they are very definite, and then they condition the experience later on. So there's no one story necessarily, and every reader has a different experience. So every reader encountering this text, these textual structures, can come away with a different reading, basically different interpretation. So when I saw that definition, I'm giving you a paraphrase of that. So, oh, this is great because that's something I can apply to other kinds of modalities of representation too, like a map or an arrangement of furniture or a VR environment where you encounter these different things. Okay, and you can tell people who there are VR worlds that are just worlds to explore, not just the worlds to explore. There are other VR worlds that have a strong narrative component, and then which may not be ordered by time. It doesn't have to be ordered by narrative time. It's ordered by things to attend to, events that happen, but the events may be interactive. This is level 2, meaning they occur because of what the visitor has done, not because of a clock. And then they shape the visitor's experience of this fictive world. Enough said? Okay, narrative. The key thing here in this passage is they're saying that narratives with closed categories can, if there's this relationship between narratives and gestalts or worlds, that relationship, if you have closed categories, can become thinner and thinner, fewer and fewer dimensions. Like, good versus evil, the Christians versus the infidel Arabs, or whatever, terrorists versus freedom fighters. I mean, it becomes more and more thin. And the basic question for the rest of the paper is, well, how do we work to open things up? Okay, it's an open question. Okay, how can we open things up? Okay. Okay. Anybody else have another passage? I think several of us pointed this out. There's a beautiful passage here on facing the future, the reality of the future. And looking at ex ante, meaning kind of exploring the future, in addition to being informed by what we learned from the past. And they take this Heraclitus, was this wonderful pre-Socratic philosopher, Greek philosopher, who is credited with that. What's his saying? You can't step into a river twice. No, that one, right? You can't step into the same river twice because it's always flowing. Time is flowing too. And they say here, if we take a Heraclitean approach, complex adaptive systems, if we take a Heraclitean approach, meaning a processualist approach, change is permanent and stability needs to be explained, not the other way around. Instead of explaining change, why is change? Why is it change? No. Just take change as given. Happens all the time. It's stability or stasis that needs to be explained or justified. It's really beautiful. Yeah. And then they have this comment on page 9 about technology. So, okay, guys, big words here. When we say technology, instead of just saying computers, how should we have a working definition for technology for the seminar? What should we put in there?
So it's interesting because this was a big focus of a class Lou and I were in with Adam last semester. And in that class, we kind of defined technology as like any tool. So like language is a technology because it's something that you use to communicate. A pen is a technology. Like really almost anything that we've created in this world, physical or mental, can be considered a technology depending how broadly you want to look at it.
After taking that class, I'm not even sure create is the right word. Discovered, I would say.
Okay, tool. Yeah. You say tool. You say Rachel says tool. So then we say tool. We think about what the tool is for. So if you say technology, then and tools, then how can we characterize tool?
Anything that's considered an asset in terms of coming to a conclusion or an answer or a practice.
So proof, mathematical proof, or syllogism will allow us to come to a conclusion. And it's a mode of reasoning, but maybe it's not quite the same as a tool. Yeah. We'll start with things that we know. Hammer is a tool. Okay, it's a tool. What's an example of a language that's a tool? That's not as easy. Actually, that's too hard. Okay, wait a minute. I better have some examples of mine. No, come on. What's another example of a tool that's not as concrete as a hammer or a screwdriver? Or we'll just build up to technology.
Rachel already said it, but a pen and paper.
For purposes of making marks that have meaning, can communicate.
I usually think of, so when I think of technology, I think of the distinction between theory, theoretical thing, a theory, what we know, things we know or think we know, and then how we're like what we need to apply, like the application of that is technical and therefore a technology.
Mm-hmm. And technical as opposed to
as opposed to theoretical, like the theory, the knowledge that we've built. I don't know. I don't know where I'm going with this.
This is fine. We got stuff here. So theory and knowledge building, be knowing about something, knowing that, okay, knowing that, or knowing why, knowing that something happened, knowing why something happened, versus if I apply a tool, then I'm actually doing that change. I'm actually enacting.
Yes. Yeah.
Okay. So I'm actually acting, making a change in the world. I could be thinking about it. That's not the same thing as making the change. Normally, just ordinarily. Okay. Okay. So now there's something else coming from media arts. What about a violin or clarinet or laptop making music? Like expressive tools for expression. Oh, I say tools. Okay, say instrument. I was thinking, I'll just introduce the word instrument. So after all, it's AME. AME is a whole bunch of artists making computer instruments to make whatever media art. So then they're making art, let's say. So should we throw them into, shouldn't we throw them into technology bag? Right, we should.
Yeah.
So it's a bit broader than tools now, right? So tools might be for enacting let's say, I use the word material change. I know that's also loaded, but it's a material change. Because I could say, I come to a decision, right? And then you have given me proof. And so I will now decide something different. So I like to think of that maybe is a bit different than applying a tool, material. So I say material change. But what about instruments, violin or electronic Ableton Live or something, Max, MSP. I mean, they're technologies. Technology.
Java and Python.
There we go. Now we get into much bigger things. A programming language. Rachel said language, like Japanese or something. Now we have programming languages too. Yeah, those are technologies, I would say. But now we're getting into the domain of language. It's a lot more open-ended than a tool. You make tools with programming languages. You can make computation tools with programming languages. Okay.
It's sort of like a basic of it's like a basis of like tools that we use, like of technological tools we use. So
okay. Remember, okay, in general, I say this always, in general, it's nice to have a working definition of a concept. Okay, that's not too sharp, right?
Yeah.
Not too universal either.
Yeah.
Because if everything's a tool or everything's a technology, then it doesn't.
You broke up a little. You broke a little bit, but I mentioned those because those are just have like a strong basis towards actually like, for example, let's say you have a musical app or like or like you have a studio system on your system. That's what powers it basically. It's like a universal language for tech nerds or tech geeks in a way.
So this is going to be relevant also for later on. We'll talk about things like pattern recognition, et cetera, et cetera. When we say programming language, it's let's mark it, okay, as somehow being really different than quote natural languages in a fundamental way, right? That's a certain fundamental ways. Can we say some of those fundamental ways?
Fundamental. I'm trying to it's like a language that kind of connects people together in a way. If you understand Python or if you understand programming languages, you kind of can understand each other, sort of. So let's say you're a person who speaks Spanish or speaks English, and they're working like a project with Python and other coding languages. They can somewhat understand how a program works because it's like one language that, yeah.
We're gonna go to Wittgenstein.
Yeah, I'm bad with the wording stuff, so yeah.
No, it's good.
It's also utility. We're actually beyond. We're communicating something we want to have done to a computer system, and we do it. We don't want to do that in binary, and so it's like a higher level. It's a translation to the computer from what we want to executing.
Yes. Now this is a key right there, right? We're talking about with the programming language, we're actually trying to get a machine, an electronic machine, to do a certain series of operations, which is different than the usage of a quote natural language like Japanese or Chinese or whatever, English, where we're communicating with another human being. Okay. And later on, in fact, this is great because it's going to set the stage for talking about language and how language is working. That's our next module. Okay. Programming languages are also what are called formal languages, right? Meaning the way they work can be defined entirely by a set of rules and a given alphabet, a bunch of reserved words, and a sort of syntax, the syntax, what is syntactical, right? And some various logical structures, loops or whatever, okay? But it's usually a pretty small number. It's a finite number. That's it. You have a so-called BNF grammar, like you actually write it out in this short series of grammar, like a cascaded grammar. You can't do that with a natural language because we can always make up stuff and it makes sense to people. Now, next module, think about how does that work? Even if people speak ungrammatically or things that would never quote compile in a formal parser, yet they can get people to laugh, et cetera, like in Mr. Bean from Rowan Atkinson, right? So that means there's some really big differences between a formal language operationally and in a lived experientially between a formal language, especially in particular programming language, and language used by humans. Really big differences in how they're used, what they're used for, and who's talking to whom, and formally. So programming languages were thrown to the bag for technology. Yes. Okay. Yes.
Well, there's also human languages are representational ultimately, or yeah, there's kind of a base of the reality that you then create the word or series of words as a representation of that reality. Whereas the programming languages, its base is the manipulation of what are those things that switch on and off? Is that transistors? Yeah, transistors.
Yeah. Yeah.
So there's like in a programming language, it's ultimately like a manipulation of the physical world.
Mm-hmm.
And then the higher the level, the programming language, the more there is representation of lower levels. But the base is the manipulation of the physical world, or the transistors, whereas the natural language doesn't have that base in the same way.
Yes. Now we can think about, in other words, what the scope of the language is, or what it acts on. We can try to think in these terms. And Wittgenstein is very helpful because he's actually very short. His epigrams are very, very brief, but also very pointed. And he's going to point out that what I just said is actually can cause more confusions if I say act on, So we'll get there. But forgive me for speaking colloquially right now. Okay. Yes. Okay. Now, what it acts on is something you can think about. Are we acting on? Maybe I'll introduce this idea of world making, based on what Cameron's saying. With the word reality, you can say, well, how about world? Okay, so the lived world, the experienced world, versus formal manipulations of tokens, which could be done in any medium. Sure. The Shock of the Ode. What tell us about this? Is this a book?
Oh yeah, it just reminds me of this reading that I was doing for another class based on the topic we're discussing, the definition of technology. Well, just when we think about technology, if we are visiting a science and technology museums versus we're visiting a folk museums, so we might saw this aircraft in a science museum, but we saw probably a sewing machine in a folk museums. But isn't the sewing machine also being considered technology, but just the technology from the past?
Yeah.
So the book just brought up a point that the technological timeline and date, if we are discussed by the invention or the innovation, it creates a bias about technology.
Mm-hmm.
So the book trying to focus on the use-centered technology. So trying to decenter the innovation. So if something is invented a long time ago, but is still being utilized up to today, then the lifespan is different from just talking about the timeline based on the inventions.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So maybe I'll introduce. So technology, I think Rachel, going back to what Rachel was saying, from your course that you guys took with Adam Nocek, who I highly recommend. If he teaches another course that you guys have access to, please, I highly recommend him. Something about how it's made by us, things that are made by us. I want to say what things are. Okay. In order to act on, let's just say this, in order to enact a material change. And I know that now I introduce two more words, things and material. Okay. But let's say that we can back up a step and think about this more ancient word techne, which I put into chat, Techne, Greek word, which is useful. People use this term to think about what humans have made to people, what people have made in order to mediate between the people and the lived world, between people and the lived world, in order to, the way I would put it, to get a grip on the material lived world and to make changes in the material lived world. Or maybe better, to make changes in my relationship, in our relationship with the material lived world. Probably it's important to say both material and lived, okay? Because you can say, if there are no living beings in the world, then, it becomes a vacuous thing. But if it's not material, then we have to say, well, what about concepts? What about concepts? What about ideas and things like that? It'd be nice to make a kind of a grade, maybe not a sharp distinction, but a gradient between material and the worlds of concept. So techne can include both technologies, like a specific device, like a hammer or something, or instrument like a violin or microphone. But think about it. If there were violins in the world, a bunch of violins lying around, but nobody knew how to do anything with them, just bang with them. There's no technique, right? If we didn't have technique, we wouldn't be able to employ them. Same thing with this thing, this mic right here, right? So that's why it's nice to bundle together, right? Technologies and techniques. So that's why it's, for me at least, it's a little bit broader, includes the how-to. How about that? Okay, so let's say technologies and techniques with this kind of general sense. Coming back all the way back to Sander and to Gary. On page 9, which is in the section Emergence of the Illusion of Control, they talk about how Western societies have defined more and more closed categories. And then what do they say here? See, one reason for making categories is to simplify the cognitive load, right? To handle the experience, right? And one way to further do that is to freeze those categories or some of those regularizations of how to deal with things, how to deal with experience into technology, right? So like, what's the most simple machine in the world? Like from your high school, what's the most simple machine in the world? What do you think? The most simple machine? It's not electronic for sure. It's ancient. What do you think would be the most simple machine? The basic
lever?
There you go. I think so. A big stick, a stick, with a pivot, right? It's been called the simplest machine, the most basic machine. It freezes, it concretizes and freezes this notion of action at a distance and multiplication of power, amplification of power, right? Based on the proportion of how much is on this side, how much is on the other side, and exert a proportionally greater power by pushing down on one end, right? So beautiful. Okay. So, but it freezes into that form a specific relation of power, etc., etc. Gears, much bigger, pulleys. Okay. Now with computers, we get the question with algorithms, what would you say would be, how do you say this? What would you say is being regularized or amplified or extended with a computer program in general? But what are some ways that levers, okay, is magnifying and displacing power to move some physical object. But what about an algorithm in a computer program?
Computation. Cameron said in the chat as
well.
And
the effect of that computation? Thinking algorithmically now, not numerically, but algorithmically. Those of you who have programmed something, this is a bit more abstract question. Think about the kind of programs you've written which are procedural. Let X get some value, or let this parameter inside an object get some value, get assigned some value, and then you perform some operations with it, arithmetic operations, logical operations with it, and then set some other values. And then you go on and on. If there's an I/O, input output, right? Then it's taking some signals from the outside world, but it's also an output. So sending something back out to actuate a robot, to change a pixel, something. And also you can trigger it to happen at some point in time, right? You can defer the action. So instead of displacing in space, you're displacing in time. The sequence of operations, logical operations, then numeric operations, and operations on strings and numbers, to some other point in time. So you don't have to do it yourselves now. So it has this ability to multiply the agency of the programmer to different locations in space and in time. And all these decisions that are being made by the human being can now be done, quote, automatically by the algorithm in some other place and time. Okay, so this is interesting. It's a sequence of, you could say, very basic operations, logical numerical operations that could be done by human brain, but it's done somewhere else, sometime else, and probably a lot faster.
Yeah, I was going to say on this faster part, it also kind of shrinks time in many ways. Right?
Yep. So now, haven't you all noticed? This is something else. However, these operations are really tiny. You know, addition, subtraction, memory permutation, right? But you think about the operation of making a phone call to persuade somebody to come and pick me up. You know, hey, please, I'm stuck at the airport. Can you come and pick me up? No, 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 no. You know, he asked me. So all that kind of stuff going on, like persuading somebody to come out at 3 a.m. to come and pick me up. So that's a lot higher, quote, higher order kind of what, you know, operation is going on, right? And anybody who's written like video programming software or sound software, you know how intricate it is to work with things at the level of indices into some array versus just taking the picture, you know, like the difference in max between just adding two images together versus walking through the pixels one by one and doing some detailed operations on the alpha RGB, you know. It's what's called expressivity of the language. So the level of expressivity of programming languages typically is quite low compared to English or Japanese or Chinese or whatever. You know, how many symbols do you need to put down before in order to accomplish some material change? It's have a large number of symbols to do in programming language. With LLMs now it's quite different, right? Because you can use natural language to ask the machine to do something, because we're using natural language, a lot of ambiguity built into it. Okay. Now, their point here, though, in this page, is that it freezes in. That technologies freeze in to material form certain modes of thinking and acting, and reduces complexity. Reduces complexity by just freezing into certain kinds of actions and operations. Okay, and it makes it very hard to change because these actions are powerful. They can be multiplied, amplified, speeded up. Okay, so we'll have to leave it at this. Okay, I really wanted to talk about this kind of how the kind of examples they're talking about, like energy transition, or in order to, you know, how would we go about dislodging or opening up the kind of relationships between narratives and gestalt and the technologies that are kind of embedded in them, okay, with them. If you have any ideas right now, I'm all ears, you know.
Well, one other thing I thought was interesting that they were speaking of on, I think it's on page 11, they were talking about like cognitive feed forward and feedback, and this is also related to our initial kickoff of the paper of the Janus thing, and quite an explicit topic of last semester's course so it's like cognitive feed-forward loop has developed and creates in our minds imagined futures and then develops those fictional expectations that motivate people. And so it's like the future feeds back the present, manipulating it. I thought I just wanted to bring this.
Oh, yeah, this is really important. Really important. Thank you. Let's look at this. That's one of the two other things I really wanted to point to. Right here. Thank you for
Well, now we're at 199.
Uh-oh. Wait a minute. What? Sorry, what?
Sorry, but bad joke.
I thought it was funny.
Oh, okay. Here. Fictionality, far from being, okay. Sorry, the feed-forward loop, this is what Cameron's pointing to, okay, has developed that creates our inner mind's imagined futures that then develops fictional expectations, okay, that motivate people towards realizing them. Okay. Now, here's the issue. Fictionality, far from being a lamentable but inconsequential moment of the future's fundamental uncertainty, is a constitutive element of capitalist dynamics, including economic crisis. Now, here's where I wanted to, okay, this is worth talking through. I wanted to break that down. And what does this mean? Ask, what does this mean? Can we rephrase this, reword this? Fictionality is constitutive of capitalist dynamics. So can we unpack this a little bit?
Well, the word fictionality here is similar but not quite the same of what narrative has been throughout the paper. Here it's emphasized as being like this is more related to story than narrative that we've used previously. And I mean, I can't unpack this all, but I think that the first thing of including the economic crises, it's like there's speculation or there's some projected sense of what's going to happen in the future, and that causes actors to behave as if it were going to happen, which then causes it to happen.
In fact, this is the right example probably because we're looking at like stock markets, but also any kind of proposition that hey, buy this thing and it will benefit you, or invest in my company because I'm telling a good story about what it's for and why it should be there and why it's worth investment, et cetera.
Well, and all of advertising relies on this, right? I mean, it first creates a sense of what you are missing, and then creates the problem, and then provides a solution for that problem that you can buy.
Yeah. And as I'm thinking about reading this, I'm thinking, well, but isn't there kind of the fictionality always at work with any kind of anticipatory thinking? So there's something maybe in particular that it's not by itself bad or good, perhaps, but it is a power of, when we're talking about the what is it here? Uncertainty of the future, the uncertainty, the open-endedness of the future. It's necessary actually because it's that which is not the case. Fiction, I would say, is that which is not the case. Talking about that which is not the case, which is different than saying it's false. It just that which is not the case. Okay, and even scientific speculation. You have different kinds of string theories, et cetera, et cetera. We don't know actually which is the case. We actually just don't. And they're mathematically, they're all coherent. They're all true in the mathematical sense. So it's very interesting. There's something here about this quote, which is more there's something bad about it. Okay, this is it's inside, it's implicit here.
Well, I think there's also the sense, and this has kind of been throughout this whole thing, that it provides a presumption that what is now will also be in the future, that it will continue to be in the future.
Yeah. Did we read Isabel Stinger's, those of you who were there last term, did we read Isabel Stinger's book, Making, no, we didn't read it. We mentioned Making Sense in Common. Okay, right. Okay, there's another book that she wrote with a guy named Piñar called Capitalist Sorcery. This is going to in reference to what Tanya just mentioned. Have any of you seen this book, Capitalist Sorcery? It's a short book, really fantastic, fun read. It's anyway, and in there she's talking about choice, and this comes up also in the next paper that we want to get to soon, which is that we are given choices as if they're all the options there are. There are no other options. Like in politics, right? Electoral politics, we have a bunch of candidates and say, okay, that's it. Just vote for one of them. That's it. That's your choice, you know? And we say that's democracy, you know, representative democracy. Or if you have, you know, a bunch of, you know, food, and say, here's your choices. If you live in a food desert, you go to a grocery store that sells basically, you know, factory made food and say, that's it. You know, hey, this is called organic. Hey, you know, that's organic. Over there it's called biological. And over there is a regular food. And those are your choices. They're labeled, you know, as just because they're labeled organic or bio. Does you feel better now? You can actually buy your bio food or organic food. So you have a choice, and that's all the choices you get. And because you have a choice, you say, hey, you know, I'm a consumer. I can exercise my freedom of choice. But your choices are already pre-given and predetermined. If, you know, so that's kind of the illusion of freedom, the illusion of consumer agency. Right. So that's part of what Isabel Stinger's meant by capitalist sorcery. This kind of sorcery that's, you know, casts a spell upon us to think that, you know, just because we have a bunch of choices means that we've been presented with everything that we need to choose from.
Well, I wonder about the division of labor of decision making, because if we had to make make decisions with 1,000 different options, everything that we did, we would get very overwhelmed. And so while there may be like, I don't know, right, like two options of strawberries at your grocery store. I mean, maybe strawberries not a good example, but the toothpastes, there's a limited number of toothpastes, and well, then you get into the definition of what is a toothpaste or not. Is mud in a tube a toothpaste? But that decision has been made already by somebody else that we've externalized or that we've entrusted to make a certain amount of choice for us by virtue of living in the society that we're in, or et cetera.
It's a very good point. It's a very good point. I mean, and for example, there's this famous, not famous, I shouldn't say that, it's not famous. There's this old work on what's called participatory economics. Okay, I'll just write this title into the chat so I can remember to give you the full reference later. Participatory economics by some left economists, Hanno and Albert, H-A-N-E and Albert. And they gave the very elaborate, worked out economic model for how communities can jointly and in phases, in stages, make decisions on how to manage their resources, you know, whether it's food or transportation or whatever. It's egalitarian, it's also multi-level. So they're kind of like family level, street level, neighborhood, city, and it's all done with direct democracy methods, et cetera, et cetera. And, you know, I was sympathetic to that. I'm very sympathetic. But then I read through this thing and said, wow, my God, it's a lot of meetings, a lot of consensus meetings, you know, really a lot. And have multiple layers, you know, how many, you have to decide like, how much ice is my family going to need for the summer? You know, and when do I decide that? You know, once every week, once every month, once a year, and it decides similarly at the level of the street, et cetera, et cetera. That was before computers. I mean, that was modeled in the early days of computers. So it might be interesting to think about what cognitive load. Having said that, coming back to Cameron, maybe the notion of decision itself is an issue. Is do we have to make these point-wise decisions? And maybe there's a difference between decision and gesture. I'll just leave it at that for later. And finally, Isabel Stinger's point is the spectrum of choice. You know, is this the complete set of choices? You know, or maybe there are other choices that are not, that are tacitly erased. That's her, I think, more her point. Okay. Complexity limit. Yes, great. Say more about this, Jason.
Well, I mean, it's on the bottom of page 15 of kind of like where do we like human societies will always bump into a complexity limit. This is very similar to what we were just discussing. And then I feel like I mean, not to be too mean on the authors, but they just sort of like throw out Eleanor Ostrom without, because the critique that you were giving with the participatory economics is exactly that you could apply that critique with Ostrom's work, polycentric governance.
Polycentric.
Yeah. But they just like throw out like this is why I argue in favor. But
yeah, I think so. Yeah, I think it's a good point that Cameron's making here, because this paper throws out certain things that really would, you know, not only to actually operate any of these things, it would take a lot more work, and to think that through. So, and then finally on page 13, just before this section here, there's something else which I thought was really quite interesting, where it goes back to the Kahneman thing. I'll just read it for you. Right, the power of reason is an illusion. The belief will not change when the reasons for the belief are defeated. So, and then he closes with that, what we heard before. People believe the reasons because they believe in the conclusions, okay? So belief comes first, the reasons for it are secondary. We see this all the time, right? And then the persistence of concepts like capitalism or the idea of progress, or we can say the idea of growth, against numerous arguments and examples and counterexamples, may be an example of this kind of reasoning. So it made me think of this famous quote from Frederick Jameson at Duke and Zizek, saying that, maybe you heard this, that it's easier to imagine, talk about ecology and climate change. It's easier to imagine the end of the world than the end of capitalism. That's true. So with that, we come to a pause in this discussion, okay? We should take a break. It's now 6:37. Right, let's take a longer break this time. Let's say 10 minutes. And in the meantime, I'll try to find my copy of the Weirdest People in the World. Now, that's a longer paper, but it's really fun to just step through the examples. So if you guys have had the time, you can maybe call up your copies of the paper. We'll come back in, and maybe we'll hear from everyone about some of their favorite examples, okay, from that Weirdest People paper. Okay, see you in 10 minutes. All right, here we are. Can you all see the syllabus? All right. So we are in this first module, representation, and the supplement actually has other articles which are quite different, but also pretty pointed. But we won't probably discuss them explicitly, but some of you are interested in that. Please go ahead and look at that. We can maybe bring them into discussions later on. So like I said, there are these sections here. We have a whole semester for these 8 sections. So some of the sections can take more than 1 week. And I'm thinking, if some people want to look at like data viz and the questions of data science, things like that, we can maybe take that up next time. But what I want to ask now is if some of you, ideally all of you, can speak to giving like a 5-minute kickoff for some of these other readings. Because I'll do the rest. I'm just saying that it'd be very good to right now hear from you to see if some of you are interested in doing a kickoff. I know that several mentioned the section on embodiment as being interesting. And here the readings have to do mostly are coming from Merleau-Ponty, phenomenology of perception, which is one of the kind of the core core entries into the question of, the senses and sense of embodiment. There's that. We talked about tools and technologies, so there's some section here. Maybe that's interesting, especially Simondo. Any takers for some of these? Because at some point we'll go around to everyone, but maybe Rachel, or which
Well,
part?
I was just gonna say I don't want to step on anyone's toes, or if maybe like it could be more than 1 week on it, but the more I looked over the syllabus and started to peek at the readings, the more I thought embodiment would relate really well to some of my research in virtual reality. But I think that one struck the interest of a lot of the group. So I don't know if anyone would want to maybe tag team it.
In fact, it's worth a couple of people or more than that looking at it because there's a lot to it.
I'd be happy to tag team that with you.
There you go.
Oh.
Great. So let me
Yay.
Rachel and Morgan. And I'll work with each of you, okay, about those readings beforehand. Rachel, Morgan, for menopause. And then we can decide, maybe more focus which sections and how. What else? And also can be other topics too. Right now, we'll cover the bases here, the basics here.
I would be interested in 6, more than human ecological experience.
Cool. Thanks, Tanya. Anybody else want to come in on that one, or another within human ecological experience? Tanya. Okay, got that. Okay. How about others?
I would be willing to try to tackle the Deleuze and Guattari.
I'll work with you on that. Okay.
Yes, please.
Okay, 8. Not the whole unit, just that one reading, right? Just that.
Well,
it's up to you.
Depends. I'm open to doing the whole reading.
We can choose.
Interesting, but
we can look at it. We can look at it together and see which ones. What could be interesting is to take a scan of them, and then decide. Okay, so.
And if you need a tag team for that one, I'd be happy to take on one of the readings that you don't, Cameron.
Yeah. Cool. Okay, so put on Cameron, and then in parentheses Morgan. That's cool. Okay, Lo and Alex, how about you guys? Maybe number 5 on given your backgrounds, maybe the first 2 of number 5 would be like the nature of tools and tool use for nature and craftsmanship by David Pye's the first bullet there. And here, let me make it bigger. Sorry, here, and especially this one here on Magnuson. And even though it's looking at musical instruments like electronic instruments and software-based instruments, it's actually more general than that. It's all sorts of tools.
I could tackle number 5.
Alex, that's Alex. Cool. Yeah. I think it's going to be interesting to hear from those of you who've been working with software-based creative instruments, creative tools. Yeah. In that case, Lo, given that you come from programming background, would you then tag maybe team with Alex?
Sure.
It seems like yeah, especially the first 2 items. Okay, Pi and Thor Magnuson, and I'll take on Simondo. I'll introduce Simondo. Okay, but if you guys can maybe look at those first two bullets, and we can talk together about it. Okay.
And I'm also looking at number 7.
7 is the
performance X.
7. Oh, in fact, yeah, you can jump to something else too, but that's a fun one for sure. Um, look, Lo, why don't you think about it and then come to me later and decide, okay?
Sure.
Performance. Yeah, that makes sense too. And in that, just in sort of different readings, I would say Brooke and Artaud, you can look at first and see if any of that catches your eye. Brooke is a very good writer. He's a very, very evocative and well, after all, he's the great director. He's a very good writer, and Artaud is pretty passionate.
Sorry, which book?
The first two authors, Peter Brook,
Okay.
and the other one, Antonin Artaud, are two kind of like classic canonical writers about theater and performance, and yeah. So they kind of go together.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And they're short chapters, but they're very evocative. So yeah, I'd be interested in what you think of them. Okay. I think I'm not missing anybody, I think, right? We're all covered. Good. All right, look, let's do this. Let's start the discussion today on the examples, and let's continue next week in person with this paper. It's a long paper and it's chock full of examples. All right. But first of all, we can just walk through a couple of examples tonight, but what's the basic point here? Somebody want to give us a kind of capsule for what their basic point is in this whole paper? It's a giant project, actually. Please, Tanya.
Yeah, this is a critique of the way social sciences have proceeded from a Western viewpoint and limited sample size in terms of the cultures that they are pulling data from. And in fact, there's a much broader variety of how people view the world, conceive the world, think of themselves, etc. And so this just does a lot of like case studies on how that's played out.
And that's basically addressing behavioral scientists, psychologists, and cognitive scientists, social scientists, too, trying to make these general claims, right, about human nature, human behavior. Thank you. So that's the key point, right? And it's based on, yes, a lot of studies, a lot of empirical studies. And that's also quite impressive. So they've done this kind of, I think they have these 4 different kinds of distinctions. I'll have to go through and find them right now. So comparisons between industrialized societies versus small scale societies, like, small forest-based cultures or nomadic cultures. Another one is comparing between, what is it? Contrast to Western versus non-Western societies, Asia, Africa, South America, Asia, Africa, Global South. And that's the second one. Another category is contemporary Americans versus the rest of the West. So Europeans, I'd say. And then, typical contemporary American subject versus other Americans. Now, what do they mean? What do they mean by the typical contemporary American subjects for the purposes of these psych research? Anybody? It's very funny. What's the most typical subject for these psych studies?
Undergraduate.
Yeah.
Undergrad psych majors.
Right.
Because what do you see the flyers, right? I'm just practically speaking. Let's say there's a psych professor, you just put some flyers around your department. I mean, it's just funny, but it's kind of based on practical limits. And maybe more categorically, it's the weird, right? White, what is it? White, educated, industrial, enriched democracies. Yeah, living in industrial rich democracies. So, and it's a very small, very narrow sample set. And it's very interesting. I mean, now let's look at some examples. I think when I first read this paper, I was just astounded by the range. I mean, what are some of your favorite examples? Let's see. The first one, right? It's cognitive perception. The famous arrow, the line segment. This one. Here. This. Oh, this is a cat. Oh, he's not going to let me do it. Okay, that one, right? So which segment is longer? Everybody here probably will say the same thing. Which one is longer? Which one looks longer?
They're the same.
Well, I know you know the answer, but the top one looks longer. Wait, yeah, the top one.
Yeah, the top one looks a little longer.
The top one looks longer. Okay, top one looks longer, and so we're members of the privileged weird class. No, I'm teasing. But in any case, but it's amazing that they found that this is not universal, and that's the table on page 64. And in study after study, they point out these different kinds. They're not just perceptual studies. They point out that the weird class of people are on the extreme end of behavioral responses, and that's going to come up at their conclusions too. Oh, please.
Sorry,
Rachel.
I have a question. Part of me just worries I'm looking at the wrong thing, because you just said page 64 and I see references.
Hang on. Oh God. Whoops. Let me
And
share.
I was a little confused because the syllabus said to read pages 61 to 83, which didn't line up with anything. I don't know if I'm the only one who was confused, but
Oh, maybe, yeah. I'm sharing a screen with this page. Is this one here? Have you seen this picture at the top right with the two
Yep.
arrows? Okay, and the bottom of that page is page 64 on at least my copy. How about you guys?
Page 4.
It's number 4? Page number 4?
Yeah, mine is numbered one of
Yeah.
70, like 1 through 75.
Oh God, version. Okay, can you share your
So
can one of you show your screen, Tanya or
can.
Rachel?
I just have a hard copy right now.
Okay, Rachel, do you have it on screen?
Can you guys see it?
Page 4? Okay, so then I'll just know to add 60 to everything. Thank you.
Okay.
So keep it on that screen. Sorry, you can keep it to us. So page 4, if you look at the bottom page 4, see that chart and all the different kinds of people, like foragers, miners to the left-hand side, and different groups. So these are small, so-called small societies. And then all the way on the right-hand side, European and Evanston, Illinois University, I guess. Okay, so if we scroll down some more, under fairness, yeah, you're right there, that diagram, that chart right there. So I think this is the chart for the ultimatum game. So the ultimatum game, anybody remember how that goes, the ultimatum game? I wanted to play this with you guys in live to see what happens, but oh well. Next week we might do some games, but not games that we read though. All right, let's come back to people. Stop sharing. Yeah. Okay. The ultimatum game is how does it work? Right. I think I can. It's a 2-person game, and A offers a percentage of A's pot of money to B. So like I say to you, I'm going to give you 30% of my pot, and you can accept or decline. If you accept, then you get the 30%, and I keep 70%. But if you decline, we both get 0. So what would you offer? What do you think if you were to play this game?
50%.
Anybody offer not 50% in this room? And why?
Well, it's interesting because from a game theoretical perspective, the since it's a one-off thing, if you offer either 100 or 99%, sorry, if you offer 0 or 1%, So 0% the receiver would be ambivalent, and then 1% they would want to accept it because it's more than they would have gotten otherwise.
But then
But
2 is more than 1,
what?
right? The 2 is more than 1, so they would want it even more, right? The other person, B would want it even more.
B
Right?
would, well, essentially B would accept anything that is greater than 0 from a game theoretical perspective.
And from a fairness perspective,
Right.
they wouldn't do that, right? I mean, it's in American white, honorary white, so the point is that in the weird setup that they tested this, 50%, right, normally. But it's really amazing that when they looked at when they ran this game, they actually ran this game in other situations. Look at this now. Let's go look here. It's really cool, actually. It's really amazing. Where do they offer? Yeah, the US sample had the highest mean offer. I think it's around 40, 50%. And yeah, in Bolivian Amazon, forest horticulturalists, I guess forager horticulturalists, I can't say that, horticulturalists, foragers in Tanzania, it's much lower. In Papua New Guinea, they tried it with these peoples called the Susurunga from Papua New Guinea. I'm looking for the numbers here. Yeah, much lower. Figure 3C offers like as low as 25%, 30%. It's in that chart that we saw Rachel show us on page 6. Okay, US is very high. It's up to 45 to 50%. And then what's interesting is the reasoning is something you can think about it, but also that's one, is some inferences are made about why this is the case. And then thanks, Cameron. And also the correlations. It says here, it's on page 5, the population's degree of market integration and its participation in a world religion both independently predict higher offers. And so throughout this paper, they're not talking about causality all the time. They're talking about high correlation, but sometimes the correlations are really quite strong. A lot of it has to do, the correlations have to do with the prevalence of market economies functional in their symbolic systems, as well as their weird sociological characteristics.
I found on this one the most perplexing or interesting outcome was that some populations would reject offers that were too high.
Yes.
That's interesting.
Absolutely. It's worth reading through some of these examples in detail because they're very careful about trying to discern why sometimes people are doing these things. The thing about rejecting offers that are too high, they call that hyper fairness, is that there's also these other games where you get punished for trying to offer too high things, and do you punish or not punish? And turns out in American, the weird societies, there is this notion of hyper fairness, meaning you want to try to keep people, the players want to enforce the idea of fairness on others. It's a meta thing, things like that. I'm looking through this part. Yeah. Another section I'm looking at is what they call folk biology. This is very funny. The one on birds, page 7, folk biology. It's like you ask a kid in New York City who's never been outside the city, and there are many, what's a bird? What's a typical bird? And they'll point to something like a robin as a typical bird rather than an owl, let's say, But then they say here, if you look at, what is this? Oh, come on. I lost my paper copy where I put all these handwritten notes, so sorry. Where is it? It's a Turkey. In this Itza Maya villagers, it's in the Mayan cultures. when you ask them what's a typical bird, they point to or they indicate a wild turkey, which actually doesn't look like most of the other birds in their region. It's not, it's not in shape or size typical. It's a very atypical. But for them, they indicate that as the typical bird, as the wild turkey, because it's cultural significance. It plays a cultural role, significant cultural role. So that means, right, that what counts as a typicality for maybe this is what they're claiming for city-bound, kids in New York City in American context is based on formal characteristics like shape, size, color, that kind of thing. Whereas for these cultures, which are much more intimately connected with the local, what do you call that, fauna, right, the animals, they have very, very intricate cultural bindings, associations with these creatures. So we ask them certain questions about typicality, they interpret it as centrality in their culture. Right. That's another one. It's very striking.
I really liked the part on spatial relationships and thinking about spatial. That one was really interesting to me in particular. I can't tell my left from my right. I ruined my sense of left and right as I spent many years as a yoga teacher, that in particular. So I have to say right when I mean left and left when I mean right. And now absolutely am not to be trusted about left and right. And if people talk about left and right, I will make sure I'm asking, is this your left, my left, who's left? Yeah. What's going on? Can we just say the clock or the wall? You know, yeah. And I thought that was really interesting, the potential differences, ego-oriented, object-oriented, relative direction, absolute direction. Yeah.
Yeah, super, super interesting. Super interesting. Here, let me see again. I drew this picture out to make it more obvious. Here, let me see if I can share screen. No, not that. Don't share screen. Share camera. Yeah, this one. So that's a cat. That's my cat. Okay, sorry. This is Casper. Casper, okay, here. This is Casper. He's very friendly and he's very large. He's a Siberian cat, and you might see him. Very fluffy. Okay, so now that's enough of you, Casper. So there, this picture, this is I think in the spatial reasoning section. It's fascinating. So here's a person facing the table, and hey, Casper's jealous. Sorry. Here's the person facing the table, right? And then facing the table to, I'll say his, okay, to their left and to their right. There are two arrows. And the arrow pointing left is, let's say, pointing north. And the arrow pointing right is facing south. And they ask the person to turn their chair around 180 degrees. So now they're facing another table, facing this way. Okay, north, south, same direction, right? But the person's right-hand arrow is now pointing north, and the person's left-hand arrow is pointing south. And you ask the person, which arrow is the same as the other arrow that you saw? And it's amazing, right? Because they say different things depending on what. So one person, in the people they say who are based in egocentric spatial frameworks, well, indicate right-hand arrow as being the same. So that means they'll associate this arrow with this arrow. The people who are in cultures which are, what is it called? Anyway.
Allocentric.
Allocentric, yeah. So based on kind of a global spatial sense, they will pick the north arrow, which arrow corresponds with north. And it's really, I too found it really fascinating. Where is that? What page are we talking about? Spatial.
My page 8, 3.4. It's section 3.4.
Thank you. Page 8, 68. Yeah. Oh, yeah. Okay. And what kinds of cultures? Yeah. an Australian indigenous group, a Mayan indigenous group. They call it geocentric cultures. It's really fascinating. And in fact, they later down at the bottom of that, they looked at 20 different languages, 20 different language groups. And it's only 3 of those language groups where they find egocentric spatial frameworks. They were Japanese, English, and Dutch. I was curious about that because they claim that it has to do also with highly industrialized societies. Fascinating. And see, along the way in this paper, they actually also tried to find these correlations with all kinds of like social economic status, the kind of economies people are living in. I don't think they talk too much about history, and that's for me one of the missing parts of this paper. They're taking a snapshot view of what's the situation presently. And it would be a lot bigger project to understand, well, how did things come to be this way historically? Okay. What else? What else? Ego. Talking about ego, there's also this thing about self definition of the self in terms of your own characteristics, versus understanding, thinking about how you are in relation to, right, a social field. So where's that section? Let's see here. Ego. I think it's called ego. Section 4, contrast between Western and non-Western societies, is on page 9 for you, some of you. I'm looking at the questions. Right. In other words, do people conceive of themselves, I'm reading out from page 10, I guess. Do people conceive of themselves primarily as self-contained individuals, as autonomous agents with attitudes, personality traits, and abilities? Or do they conceive of themselves as interpersonal beings intertwined with one another in social webs with role-based obligations towards others within those networks, right? And then, not surprisingly, I guess, considering the context here, Westerners have more independent views of self than non-Westerners. There's a test I don't think described in here. They don't make it explicit, called the 20 statements test. Does anybody know what this is? I don't know what it is. 20 statements test. Well, we can Google it later. Okay. When I was reading this part, I mean, they're staying within the kind of psych test, but then I'm thinking, you know what? It's obviously, right, this is a short step to make. Then this can play out in different kinds of notions of politics and democracy. Because I get this all the time when I talk to people about how Chinese think about their political cultures so differently than typical American concepts of what constitutes, say, the kind of democracy people want to live in. I was born in the United States. Okay, I was born in Washington, D.C., but my parents came from China, and they came as university people, so they were educated in a certain way. But I was raised Chinese. I was raised in a kind of a Chinese cultural milieu by my mom and my father in very traditional ways. My first language was Chinese, but I went to school from first grade on, American schools, Ohio, in fact. So very fond memories of Dayton, Ohio, and everything. So, but I understand, right, very from upbringing, this difference in attitude about thinking first in terms of the group and then thinking of oneself. So just how I was raised, differently. But then I'm also quite aware of thinking also in terms of ego-based psychology. So it's really quite strong. And it comes up, it really is interesting how this inflects one's judgment of what people call freedom, or freedom. It's really quite profound. It's really quite profound. And so it's very interesting to finally see this kind of psych study that actually teases out these differences. They don't follow conclusions to politics, but this is strictly inside behavior and psychology. But I think
No, I thought that's absolutely the first thing I was thinking of while I was reading that, and just how difficult it is to get people to think collectively. Yes, even when it's in their best interest.
Yeah, yeah. Give you some ideas. Um, let's see. Can we? Okay. People say family is important. Okay, family is important. Family is important in many cultures. Uh, one of the founding myths of China that I was taught too, even though I was born in the States, is the following. There's this kind of mythic three emperors of China set back in the mythic times of Shang Dynasty, and then or Shang Xia Zhou. Okay, so these mythical physical meaning there's archaeological evidence, but it's not a direct written history going all the way back 5,000 years, but there's definitely archaeological evidence, okay? Now, according to the mythical history of China, the first three emperors of China were greatly revered because they became emperor of China for merit rather than just bloodline. So these are the founding stories of China, which is very interesting. The second one, the story was he was commissioned by the first emperor to control the great floods of China. And this is a historical and archaeologically true thing, that there were giant floods because of the way the rivers would overflow the banks. And the Yellow River would kill thousands and thousands of people in the kingdom. So according to the story, this man of great virtue and great technical acumen worked for 20 years. He would just ride, out to the country to oversee the works of the dikes and dams and everything. And he would pass by the doorway of his home and never entered the house to visit his family because he was on a mission in service to the empire, to serve the empire. And that was a kind of a story that people tell to talk about his dedication. Even though family is so important in Chinese culture, it was an even greater loyalty to the kingdom. And it was a great sacrifice. It was such a sacrifice, that only after 20 years did he actually step in the doorway to actually visit his own children, his wife, etc. Because of this loyalty, the first emperor abdicated and ceded his throne to this man, and he became the second emperor of China. This is the story that children are told. Okay, this is the kind of story, right? This kind of thing. I'll give you a flavor. Another story is when I was growing up, my mother said that the perfect host, the good host, the perfect host is, perfect hosting, okay, it's a relational thing. Not host, but perfect hosting is when the guest, how does it put it? The guest, the host is putting something in place for the guest just at the moment the guest thinks of asking for it. So that's the mark of perfect hosting. So the guest never has to explicitly ask for something. And it's already there. Sounds like Amazon AI, right? Predictive consumer predictions. But this is a story I was told when I was a child. Okay, so this is a relational thing. This is another aspect of their psych test, is thinking about the definition of a of a social subject or subjectivity in terms of relation, not in terms of self. Okay. Yeah. So, okay, I should stop talking. Somebody else come up with an example from here. I can. Yeah, lots of different ones. I'm pulling through this. Right. This thing I just mentioned about relation on page, I think it's page 12 here. This is actually even more fundamental, and I'm going to share screen here. Okay. And I don't know if I mentioned it in the seminar yet, but I think I mentioned something in the previous seminar. There's different kind of, how do you say, approaches we can take to questions of ontology or to social structures. Cameron mentioned in complex adaptive systems, this use of the graph, like nodes and arcs joining nodes as a conceptual structure to represent all sorts of dynamical systems, okay? So that's one kind of relationality, like how cities are joined together, or how the parts of the body, the organs of the body are joined together, let's say by the circulatory system, or right, or economy. Now, but there are other kinds of ways to think about relationality too that don't have to be described in terms of a graph. But here, on the top of this page, they talk about holistic thinking, which is here, as they say, it's an orientation to context or to field, okay, and relationships between the object and the field, versus this kind of analytical thinking, which is thinking about objects detached from context, defining an object on its own terms. Going back to the ego thing again, right? I can think of myself in terms of my capacities, my economic whatever parameters, you know, or even my genealogy, but it's all in terms of me, right? Well, maybe genealogy is not right. I shouldn't say genealogy, of my capacities. Versus thinking of my situation with respect to family or society, right? And then thinking in terms of what kind of norms condition or govern my relationships with my society. Okay, first, thinking of that first. But this can be extended to a metaphysical level too, thinking about objects in general. Do we think about objects and entities in themselves? Or do we think of them as how they operate in the field, okay, with other objects? Okay. Makes sense? So can we have an example? Like a word, okay? Here's an example. How do we define the word? This would be looking to Wittgenstein. So the common way to, if you're trying to learn a new language, okay, different language, and you come across a word you don't understand, what do we do? Typically, what are the different ways, you know?
Oh, Xin Wei, I just want to, what, for timing,
Oh, we're over time.
A little bit over.
Oh no, oh my God, I'm sorry. You guys are very polite. I'm sorry. What's going on and on? Okay, no wonder. Then I will see everybody in person next week. Okay. But what we should do, like I said, we should pick up with this article and come back with examples. All right. And I'll try to remember what I was talking about with respect to words and entities. All right, Cameron.
Well, that'll help with the Wittgenstein we're reading for next week.
No, we won't do Wittgenstein yet. Okay, but
oh, let's. We won't.
Actually, should we? Let me take a look. Oh, damn. Okay, we'll do that. We'll start Wittgenstein as well. So let's finish this article next week, because I want to people to come back with examples. We'll go around the table and just people pick their examples and talk about their examples. Okay. The Wittgenstein. Maybe what we can do there is not Wittgenstein yet, but look at the other bullets. David Morris's article and Sickert's article, okay? I'll put this into the email to you all for next time. Morris and Sickert. Enjoy your dinners. Enjoy your dinners. Good night. See you next week. Okay.
Good night. Thank you.
Okay. Bye-bye. You've been very kind. Bye.